Hey guys, happy Friday. So, I feel like another wave is coming on. For me, anyway. I don't know where you guys are with it, but personally, I think it may be a good thing that we're all taking turns with this wave thing and experience it at different intensities and different durations. I mean, just imagine if we were all on the exact same schedule. I don't think the lower collective consciousness would be able to handle it. I mean, it's already crazy enough as it is. So, I mean, it's so brilliant the way this whole process is working out because we're still riding the wave as a group, but to varying degrees at any given time. And for anyone who's like, what is she talking about? I'm talking about the end of the world as we know it. I'm talking about the separation of the higher collective consciousness from the lower collective consciousness. And from what I've seen so far, right now it looks like there's just a small group of people who are going through this process. I know everyone else around me seems to be totally anchored to the lower collective consciousness earth and the quote unquote real world. I mean, I could be wrong. Some people could be going through the same thing, but just pretending, like a lot of us are forced to do, especially at work. But I know the people I interact with in the non-internet world don't seem interested at all in this life-changing shift that's going on. And maybe it's because I don't socialize with people a lot. I don't know. But this wave I'm talking about, it all goes back to the God Ocean thing that I talk about in my other videos. I just recently mirrored a video called The Spiritual Meaning of Water. Apparently, multiple people are getting the deeper messages about the water. But what this wave is it's basically a wave of Christ consciousness or divine energy or whatever name you want to give to it. It's rippling back to us from the future. Like, the future already exists, guys. It's already happened and it is happening because everything is happening in God's now. Linear time is an illusion, but human language is built around having to use linear time pretenses. So if it seems like I'm validating linear time, I'm really not. It's just hard to explain things in a way that transcends our human concepts of linear time. But yeah, these ripples from the future are so beyond any human words or concepts. So if what I say sounds like a paradox, that's because it is. I guess I'll start by saying matter is a lie, and the world you think is a physical world is actually made up of consciousness. Not only is it made of consciousness, but it's observed by and takes place in consciousness. And I've gone into greater detail about this on other videos, so I'm not going to get into how it's a provable fact that physical matter is a lie. But just know that you are not your body. You never were. You're a holographic consciousness fractal of God. And what you think is a planet, and really all of existence itself, is actually a dream that's occurring within the mind of God or Source. And I use Source and God interchangeably. It's like the same thing for me. Just FYI for anyone who's new to my channel. But don't think the word dream implies that none of this matters. On a spiritual level, dreaming is just another name for creating. And of course, God's creation matters. It's all there is. Even heaven takes place inside of God's mind. It's just heaven is in a way higher vibrational frequency dream. So we're a function of source consciousness because we reside inside of source consciousness, and we're a part of source consciousness. You yourself, really there's no you, because there's no separate self, but on a relative level, you're the agency through which God experiences a world. Just like your own night dreams, in order to experience your night dreams, your mind divides itself into an apparent subject living inside of what you perceive to be a world in order for you to walk around in your night dream and experience that dream world. But really, that night dream world is composed of nothing but your consciousness. So it's like what's happening on a micro level seems to be a mirror of the macro level, or vice versa. I think the saying is as above, so below. And like I said, this world isn't physical. It's made up of consciousness. That's why I use the dream analogy, because a dream consists of nothing but consciousness, and a dream can't exist without a dreamer. So there's individual dreaming and collective dreaming. All of our individual dreaming, which is what we call our daily life, all of that creates a collective dream. That's what Earth is. There's no world out there that exists independent of the collective consciousness. It's not physical. It never was. What we call Earth is a collective dream. And up at the very top level or layer, up at the very top is God dreaming and experiencing all the individual and collective dreams simultaneously. I mean, you know how intricate your mind is. So just imagine how infinitely vast God's mind is. And even though it's all going on inside of God's mind or consciousness, there's different dream levels going on at different frequencies simultaneously. The higher the dream frequency level, the more access a holographic consciousness fractal has to consciously experiencing God's unconditional love. That's the difference. That's what differentiates the higher collective consciousness Earth dream from the lower collective consciousness Earth dream. I'm not talking about night dreams. I'm talking about like your life right now is dreaming. You're dreaming right now. That's what life is. And I know I don't need to tell y'all that this lower collective consciousness Earth feels like a bad dream. But we don't have to stay in this lower level dream. Like some of us are already starting to separate from this nightmare and form our own higher collective consciousness Earth dream. I call it the new Earth. And I know at this point some people may be like, well, if I'm separating from here and going to new Earth, then why am I still surrounded by the lower collective consciousness zombies? And my answer to that is, you're right. Your body is still here on this Earth, but you're not your body. You're consciousness. So when a Christ consciousness wave comes in and you merge with the new Earth for a while, it's not your body that physically leaves. It's your state of consciousness that merges with the higher collective consciousness Earth. And you know, a lot of times we think of the veil thinning as being this external process. And you could say it is to a certain extent if someone is still basing their worldview off of the matter model. Like if they see the electromagnetic field as something that exists outside of the collective consciousness, then I can see how it would seem to be something happening outside of themselves. But on a deeper level, a big part of the veil thinning is the thinning or decreasing of our spiritual amnesia. That's the veil that separates our conscious mind from our subconscious mind. And I think our subconscious mind is where that direct connection with God is always present, even if we're not consciously aware of it. And I'm starting to think that the subconscious mind is the part of ourself that's it's the part of ourself that's our higher self. And in the future, when this spiritual amnesia thins out completely, we'll be totally conscious of our connection with Source and our higher self, and we'll be totally conscious of Christ consciousness. And when a wave comes in and you're in that Christ consciousness state, it literally feels like heaven on earth. And I promise you, it won't matter to you that your body is still here, because that's how strong these Christ consciousness waves are. It's ecstasy. It's beyond words. And this thing called the God ocean is real, guys. Every day we're being told about it, but we have to turn our mind on to notice it. And like I said, the higher collective consciousness is a small group, but it doesn't matter because we're connected to Source. We're even connected to each other on a deeper level. That indescribable Christ consciousness love bliss wave that you experience, it's the same Christ consciousness wave another person on the other side of the world experiences. You feel it expand in your chest, and then you know you're not alone. You just know. And what I'm finding is the higher you get, the more obvious it becomes that the God ocean is real. You could say each of us, each holographic consciousness fractal is like a tiny drop of water that merges with the God ocean when a Christ consciousness wave comes in. I just wish I could stay in it and not get that spiritual amnesia that comes and goes. It's so different from this lower collective consciousness state that everyone here thinks is normal. I mean, I get why the amnesia always comes after a wave recedes, because it's like your consciousness goes back into being in a contracted state or a contracted form. But I'm telling you guys, the intensity and duration of the Christ consciousness waves can grow if you just try to stay in it for longer periods of time. Like, that's how I'm learning to hold on to my memory of my higher self and forget less often. But this lower collective consciousness earth was built to make us forget. That's why I keep talking about the music, because somehow, I don't know the exact mechanism behind it, but somehow these ripples from the future are able to use things like music to help us retain our memory of the new earth higher collective consciousness state. I mean, it uses other things like synchronicities and movies too to communicate. But for me, music is one of the main ways it gets through. I started calling this communication the retro-causality language because it comes from a future time when this Christ consciousness is our normal state. And I just want to read a comment NZPest left on my radio challenge video. Basically, he was talking about how he's able to hear the retro-causality language, but his wife hears the exact same song and hears nothing. He said, quote, "This week I felt compelled to play Van Halen even though I've never really liked them very much. The song Love Walks In, which I've never heard before, came on, and it almost brought me to tears. The message was so powerful. I shared with my wife, but she couldn't hear it," unquote. So I just wanted to share that to show you guys there's lots of people getting the message ripples. And at the end of this video, I'm gonna put up some exercises So you guys can practice tuning into the retrocausality language for yourself. But keep in mind, just because his wife couldn't hear the retrocausality language that day, that doesn't necessarily mean she'll never hear it. Really, I think it comes down to whether she's destined to separate herself from the lower collective consciousness or not. I think at this point, if you're over the age of 30 and you're just still going along with the status quo and not noticing how increasingly bizarre the lower collective consciousness earth is becoming, then that's probably a good indicator that you won't be going to new earth. And the polarization, it's going to continue to grow as we separate more and more from it. Now, I believe if someone's destiny is to experience new earth, then nothing can stop them from fulfilling their contract with God. I mean, our higher self is already merged with the Christ consciousness. So in that sense, you could say there's no free will when it comes to this, because I mean, it's already happened. It's already happened. What I do think we have free will over is how long it'll take someone to bring that Christ consciousness experience into their own human experience or human awareness. And again, I'm talking on a relative level because we aren't really human in the physical sense. We're so much more than that. So before I show you guys some of the retrocausality language transmissions I got from these songs I'm going to play, I want to show this chart I got a download of. And I know I've talked about this on my other video, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. And I'm not saying this chart is, like the end all be all, because there's lots of ways to raise your emotional frequency to connect with God. But I think this chart is it's a good way to show why some people hear the messages and others don't. So the red part represents the lower collective consciousness earth dream. This is the reality that the majority of people say is our normal state. It's not. It's there that we're conditioned since we were little to believe that everything around us is just dead physical matter. And if they did tell you God existed, then they said Source was this far away entity that never communicates directly with us. Or maybe they told you Source used to communicate with people back in biblical times, but certainly not today. If we weren't told these lies when we were little, then it would have been a lot easier as adults to see that God is constantly trying to communicate with us because we're a part of Source. Even the lower collective consciousness individuals who have chosen to permanently divorce themselves from God, from their perspective, God isn't reachable, but from God's perspective, there isn't any real separation. I mean, where else would you go? They couldn't escape from God even if they wanted to. The most they could do is delude themselves by making themselves blind to what's right in front of their face. They would do that in order to block out God's love, or to block them from perceiving God's love, if that makes sense. That's why they work so hard to convince us that all music is nefarious, or at best, music is just about human romantic relationships and there's no deeper meaning behind it. It's just a shame because whether someone is permanently merged with the lower collective consciousness earth because they're malevolent, or they're of the light but just haven't woken up yet, if someone is living on the lower collective consciousness earth, regardless of the reason why, they're going to be deaf to the retrocausality language. And for them, Christ consciousness will seem like this exotic, unattainable state. So it's like a feedback loop that has to be broken in order to transcend that lower level, if that person is of the light. If not, there's no separating them from it. That's their home. They like to be down there. But in order to start to separate from the lower collective consciousness, the first thing we have to do is break out of those lower collective consciousness emotions, because it's our emotions that anchor us to the lower collective consciousness, and it's our thoughts that control our emotions. So really we need to get control over our thinking patterns too. If we put our attention on all the negative thoughts that the lower collective consciousness tries to distract us with day in and day out, then our emotions are going to be that magnet that pulls us down. And as long as we're fixated on lower frequency emotions, the song meaning is going to sound empty at best, and at worst, the song is going to sound nefarious in some cases. For me, the easiest way to raise my emotional frequency is to focus on God and practice mindfulness throughout my day. And now that I've been hearing the retrocausality language for a while, I'm to the point to where all I have to do is just listen to a couple songs to break me out of those lower frequency emotions whenever that magnet tries to pull me down. And I mean, I get it. It takes time. But once you're able to focus on feeling those higher frequency emotions, you can open yourself up to the possibility of hearing the retrocausality language. And if we can slow down and get our thoughts to focus only on God's love, then it's easier to block out all the distractions. And once you can do that, you'll start to hear bits and pieces of the song stick out to you. I know for me, it started with the escape key meanings. So escape key meanings are usually messages giving spiritual survival instructions and information about earth changes that signal a time of spiritual awakening. And it'll also give non-fear-based knowledge about the spiritual war. Now, even though this level is considered a part of the higher collective consciousness, it's right above the lower collective consciousness earth. So dualistic concepts are still there, kind of, but they're used to help us climb higher into the yellow. Now the yellow is where the song meaning screams new earth. It's where the dualistic concepts and the song meanings start to fade away. And that's where the Christ consciousness waves can become really strong sometimes. I think the meaning behind the song actually becomes less complicated on that level too. Like the song just turns into a serenade where God is communicating all the different ways He loves you. And I'm not talking about only like a selective few songs. I'm talking about just your average songs you hear on the radio. A lot of times that's what the retrocausality language will use to try to get your attention. That and synchronicities. But once you cross that border and mentally leave the lower collective consciousness meaning level, that's when it becomes really obvious that the song has absolutely nothing to do with superficial things like human romantic relationships. It's like the song reveals what was always there. It turns into a love song about the original love affair, which is the love affair between yourself and God, not about a boyfriend, girlfriend love affair. So like for example, there's a line in the first song I'm gonna play that says, quote, "Show me how you do that trick, the one that makes me scream," she said, unquote. Now, if you're anchored to the lower collective consciousness earth, then the word trick is probably going to be seen as a reference to some kind of matrix black magic, and the line about making her scream could be seen as a sexual reference. But if you can focus if we can focus our attention on God's love and mentally separate ourselves from the lower collective consciousness meaning level, then those low frequency ideas that we were all brainwashed into accepting as our dominant mode of thought, those fade away, and we're able to define that song line based on higher concepts. So once we start to merge with a higher state of consciousness, the word trick turns into a reference for God's magic or God's grace. And God's magic is the original magic. Like, don't get it twisted. That Matrix black magic stuff, yes, that's a real thing, but what they did is they stole the original magic, which was God's magic, and tried to invert it. But when we can get our mind onto these higher concepts, we see that the meaning goes back to the original meanings, if that makes sense. So, like I said, trick turns into a reference for God's magic or God's grace. And then the part that says, the one that makes me scream, she said, with that, the word one instantly shifts into a metaphor for the one meaning source. So it's like the line says, show me how you use God's grace or God's magic to scream, i.e. call attention to the one source. And later on, I'm going to get into what the she in this song represents and how it relates to us. But I want to show you guys some of the retrocausality transmissions I got from these songs real quick before I play them. So, as usual, the lyrics that mention the words day and morning instantly got changed into a reference about a time of spiritual awakening. The word on morphed into escape key level instructions telling us to turn our mind on, to tune into the retrocausality language and Christ consciousness, and essentially source communication. The words above, up, and raise all took on the same archetypal meaning of rising up above the lower collective consciousness to merge with a higher state of consciousness. And it's not something that happens externally or even physically, guys. It's something that happens within our own individual awareness or consciousness. That's how two people could be sitting in the same room, and one person is anchored to the lower collective consciousness earth, while the other person sitting right next to them is experiencing new earth. But the word in the lyrics changed into instructions telling us to go inside our heart within our own God center instead of focusing on the so-called external material world. And the lines that mention the words away, far, and gone stood out as references about going far away from a lower state of consciousness to merge with a higher state of consciousness where it's possible to experience Christ consciousness. Now, the word run in the song could also mean running away from the lower collective consciousness, but it could also mean run as in functioning properly. Kind of like how we say a car runs, but in this case, it's talking about our consciousness itself running properly, the way God designed us to run. There's also a part in the two songs that mentions my eyes, which stood out as a metaphor for how God uses us as his eyes. There's even a part that says, quote, I close my eyes and all I see is you, unquote. It's kind of funny how the retrocausality language works, because it doesn't just use metaphors and archetypes to get a message across. It uses all kinds of wordplay. It changed the word close into a reference about being close to someone instead of being about closing someone's eyes. So basically the line was talking about how God is close to his eyes, aka us, and he sees all of us. Everything he sees is just an extension of himself. And I know I use male pronouns, but you could say her too, because I think there's a divine feminine aspect to God. But do you see how the pronouns get blurred between the I and the you? That happens a lot in songs, and I think it's to show us how close God is with us. It's to show us there's no separation because we're literally a part of Source. So our eyes are his eyes. Source doesn't see any separate parts. It's all just different parts of the one source. So like the word hands in the lyrics, that got changed into a metaphor for God's hands. But going back to this divine feminine aspect of God, that's where the new earth comes in. And a lot of times with the retrocausality language, you'll hear it referred to us as new earth. Because remember, there's no external world somewhere out there that exists independent of the collective consciousness. Our perceiving of the world is our dreaming of the world. I'm not talking about a night dream. I'm talking about our waking life being a kind of dream. Because all dreams are made of nothing but consciousness. Whether we're talking about a night dream or a daydream, and all of our perceiving it's all a part of God's dreaming or God's consciousness. And it's our consciousness, the little tiny pieces of the infinite consciousness, it's our consciousness that makes up our individual reality bubbles and the collective reality. So New Earth is literally made up of the higher collective consciousness dreamers, us. That's us. So whenever you hear a song mention female pronouns or even a woman's name, it's our name that's being called. So in these songs I'm going to play, they mention words like girl, she, her. Those all got translated into a reference to Mother or Mother Earth, aka New Earth. So through those female pronouns, the retrocausality language transmitted that New Earth is composed of the higher collective consciousness. And each of us is a little piece of the New Earth. We're a piece of her. The songs that mention her, it's not talking about a girlfriend or whatever human level stuff you think her is referring to in the songs. That her is your name being called in the music. If we could just listen. Now, New Earth, it's found within the hearts of those who are destined to merge with Christ's consciousness. That's the difference between the lower collective consciousness Earth and New Earth. There is a life force on this New Earth that you can literally feel. It's an actual sensation in your body. It's something that the lower collective consciousness Earth could never hold. Like you can't even grasp that concept when you're down in that lower collective consciousness, because your memory's been taken away. But once you rise above that, you'll see, like, it's all this stuff that's been right in front of your face this whole time. Multiple times the song mentions the words breath, life, and breathe, which changed into archetypes for God's life force or Christ consciousness. And I'm almost done decoding, guys. The homophone here, H-E-R-E, switched to here, H-E-A-R, which stood out as a reference about hearing that God is here with you. And then the song line that mentions the word one morphed into a metaphor that represents God. The words oceans, water, and waterfall changed into an archetype for the consciousness arc and God ocean in the song. So like I said earlier about our consciousness being like tiny drops of water in the infinite consciousness, the God ocean is what we merge with when we experience Christ consciousness. Because that's how much love you feel when you enter that higher state of consciousness. You could say it's a whole ocean's worth. The same thing happened with the homophone C. So S-E-E and S-E-A took on a double meaning of the God ocean and spiritual sight. And there's a part in the second song that says, quote, every teardrop is a waterfall. You're going to get personalized messages with that line. For me, because I can only speak for myself. For me, that line was about how it doesn't matter whether the tears are sad tears or happy tears. At the end, it all leads to a waterfall. And it's the water from the God ocean that's falling from way up there and that higher frequency dream level down to where we are. And it falls by entering into the awareness of each holographic consciousness fractal individually. And that's only the beginning. First, the idea falls into your awareness by entering your conscious mind. Then over time, it permeates your emotional body. And then everything in your life changes. It's like you discover something that was missing from your life, and it's like looking back, you gain this understanding of why there were times when you felt depressed or unfulfilled. You learn that depression had nothing to do with missing anything on a human level. You were depressed because you were missing out on experiencing the essence of what you really are. You were yearning for the love of Source, even if you weren't consciously aware of it. That's the only reason we ever feel a sense of lack. But the part in the song that mentions the word kiss got changed to a metaphor for a kiss from God. And then the last thing I wanted to decode from the retrocausality language was the word dream. It turned into a reference about the dreamlike nature of God's creation. And I know I kind of already touched on that earlier, but if anyone's interested in a more detailed explanation of how God is dreaming us into existence, I'll put a link in the description to a video I did. It's called God's Mind, Synchronicity, McKenna's Time Wave Zero Theory. It's all just one video, if anyone's interested. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and play these 3 songs. Just keep in mind, it won't always use what we call proper grammar because it's trying to describe the indescribable. And when you listen to the song, try not to focus on the human artist who's singing it. See it as God using that artist to have a conversation with you. I mean, God can do that. Regardless of how matrix-oriented a specific artist may be, God can still use them as a vessel to get a message across. That's how powerful Source is, guys. And 9 times out of 10, the artist isn't even conscious of the deeper messages being conveyed. But I didn't decode everything in these songs just because each person should be doing that on their own. Because the way the retrocausality language works is it uses music to reflect the unique spiritual journey of each person. So that's how 2 people hearing the same song can get different messages. And I capitalized certain lyrics to highlight some of the transmissions. So I would say, look at the screen if you want to, but don't get too caught up in the reading just because this is more of a right brain activity. And keep in mind too, the transmissions have to get filtered through your thoughts before the messages can come into your conscious awareness. So just be mindful about focusing on any distractions or negative thoughts during the song, or really, focusing on any lower collective consciousness thoughts or distractions about the past or the future. Just use the next few minutes to focus on being present with Source. And just focus on God's love throughout the whole song. And really ask yourself, God, if you could send me a message or a sign through this song, what would you want to tell me about?
I turn the music up, I got my records on. I shut the world outside until the lights come on. Maybe the streets are alive,